Hi, this is your host Sapnil Bhartia and welcome to TFR Insight, a show where we deep dive into open source and emerging technologies. And today we have with us Robin Schumacher, VP of Product at Netdata. Robin, first of all, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
So today we are going to talk about open source. First of all, open source is very close to my heart and career. Ever since I finished my journalism career, I have been covering open source. So it's something near and dear. And the way we look at today's world, there's a huge, massive shift. Every company, sometimes the funny thing is companies don't realize, but they are touching and using open source in one capacity or the other. Even we are using Zoom. I'm pretty sure that they are leveraging a lot of open source technology in the backend, even if Zoom is not an open source client. So let's start with open source and how it has kind of changed the industry in general, because a lot of companies, including my IBM, they keep coming up with surveys that developers, even a lot of customers, they want to rely on open source code base. There are many reasons. They may be evaluating it internally and they now want a commercial support for open source, or they don't want a vendor login so they can move from one player to other player. So let's start with, why do you see a shift towards open source? It's not a new thing. It has been happening for a very long time. But from your perspective, let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So just a little bit about my background. I have been doing open source since 2005, and I first became acquainted with open source while I was at MySQL. So that was my very first company where I joined that open source was a very strong, obviously, driving factor. So back then, what you had were companies who realized the threat of open source in terms of taking away their current customers, because open source obviously offered strong innovation benefits and very strong cost benefits over the proprietary software that the companies were using and offering at the time. And so their first reaction was to deliver freeware versions of their particular sets of software that were very scaled down, very limited, and we at MySQL labeled that, from an industry standpoint, crippleware. And so you had IBM, you had Oracle, you had Microsoft, all these guys that would give, in our case, our industry was database. And so they would provide a very scaled down version of database, but it was limited to one CPU or 10 gig of data, or take your pick. You could only run it on one machine or something like that. And the market saw that for what it was. A very lame attempt to try to counteract open source, and it didn't work whatsoever. We never saw any kind of threat or draw away from our open source sets of software from that type of tactic. And so I think today companies have realized that type of failure, and in an attempt to ensure that they are courting the most important profile that is in the market, which is the developer. The developer, they are the ground troops that take new technology into a company, regardless of its size, whether it's big or small. Developers are the ground troops that usher in the new technology. And as you said, the developers are very very eager to use open source software because of the various benefits they see. They don't have a lot of entries to barrier, whether it's cost, whether it's use, contributions, take your pick. And so the companies now that you mentioned, the larger companies, have implemented pure open source strategies in hopes of attracting developers and minimizing the issues we talked about earlier.
I think this is a coincidence, because I also started my open source journey around 2005 when I finished my graduation. And I have, talked to the vendors and all those things from MySQL, when the MariaDB was also created. So I've been tracking all those things. And you're absolutely right. In early days, all those companies, actually some of those companies were looking at open source as a competitor, to be honest. They were not looking at open source. So a lot of effort, dirty efforts went into FUD. A lot of FUD was there against open source. But over time, as the market, and I think Linux played a very big role in getting companies comfortable that you don't have to worry about that your source code is out there. You can still compete in the market. And then we have a Red Hat model is there, SUSE is there, Canonical is there. If you look at the whole cloud, it runs on Linux, all the way from, even Azure, I think more than 60-70% machines they run on Linux. And actually now Microsoft, ironically, is one of the biggest distributors of Linux because WSL too, it has a Linux kernel in it. So there has been a massive shift there. And that shift has a lot of things that happened. And then there are organizational Linux foundations. They also contributed heavily in creating a neutral body. So even because in early days, I don't want to name any project, there used to be dual licenses, Java and all those things, where you can have a fully open source license for your personal or whatever it is, but you have to buy a license or pay for something. So the companies were controlling a lot of things there, but as with the evolution of Apache is there, a lot of foundations that made company comfortable. Even like Netdata, you guys can sit down with your competitors to work on an open source project while your sales team will compete in the market to gain market share. So can you also talk about how the open source itself evolved with changing time, which made these companies even more comfortable with not only becoming from consumers to users and then contributors of open source?
Yeah. So make no mistake, there is a big distinction between an open source project and actually a product that is based on open source. And so in the early days, what you had, a lot of people were beginning to try to use open source projects in and of themselves. And they ran into issues doing so. Whether it was quality control, whether it was lack of support and help that you needed, things like that, these became real issues that people struggled with. Not so much today. Today, the various business models of open source, whether that's a subscription model, open core, maybe a support model, which isn't as lucrative or possible anymore in terms of longevity. And then, of course, the SaaS-based model used by the clouds is becoming extraordinarily popular, using open source as as an on-ramp, that type of thing. And so these are the ones that you see today. And people are pretty, as you said, comfortable using them, with the primary driver, again, being cost control and lock-in avoidance. So that if a vendor begins to raise its rates incredibly, people are able to actually walk away and keep their data, applications, whatever you want, intact beyond the reaches of a particular vendor who maybe is getting a little bit more aggressive from a cost standpoint.
You brought a very great point about product versus project, and sometimes the lines get blurred in some cases. Sometimes companies tend to create project with a totally different name, a product is different. When I look at open source, I always look at it as day one problem. You downloaded the project, you installed it. What about updating it? What about keeping it patched? What about adding extra functionality? That's where commercialization of open source come into place. And commercialization, as much as a lot of people will raise their eyebrows, is critical to sustainability of open source. No matter what model you are, a SaaS model or license, whatever model you offer, commercialization is very important. So, and I think as these companies are emerging to offer support, commercial support for open source, irrespective of what model it is, that is also critical, and that is also kind of leading to the further growth and adoption of open source.
Yep, absolutely, agreed. And so when you're looking at the possibility of using open source for your company, there's a number of things you need to look at. You need to look at the viability of the actual project itself and the community that supports it. If there's a very strong and viable vendor who's behind that, whether or not you're able to actually utilize support and get help when you need it. And then, again, it has to be able to fit into your cost model in the way that you're comfortable doing business, whether that's open core or whatever else, subscription models and things like that. But the good news is, unlike back when I started in 2005, a lot of this stuff is very mature. It's very accepted. The hostility that you used to see in terms of people beginning to commercialize and productize open source, a lot of that has gone by the wayside because people understand that you have to have the business side of open source to be able to support all of it. If that goes away, then you're left holding the bag in many cases.
Right, and that becomes more important when you're looking at big vendors, big players like I mean, I don't want to name any company, for example, Uber, Lyft, whoever, Netflix, they are big companies. They consume a lot of open source, but they also create. But when we look at the smaller companies, they may not have all the resources that they cannot even become active contributors to open source, but they also need it. So what are some of the things that they should keep in mind when they start putting all of their eggs in the open source basket?
Yeah. So a number of the things I mentioned earlier are key when you're starting out with open source. Again, you want to look at the viability of the project, its contributors, it's the momentum that it has in the marketplace. And if it has, again, a strong, viable commercial vendor behind it, it becomes very, very important, or at least a strong, thriving community of many different contributors that are keeping the open source project viable. But the other thing that you want to make sure that you're looking at is that you're able to get assistance and help when you need it. As an example, I remember a couple of years back being at a customer site, and we got a call from one of the top 3 electronics retailers in the country, and they were using a competitive product to ours that is now defunct, but their entire staff that supported that open source project and its contribution it made to their business walked out in a single day. And they were left holding the bag. They had no support model. They had nothing to fall back on. They were left in the lurch, and they were talking to us, how can we begin to migrate what we have to you, and how? So you want to avoid things like that. And so even if you're a very, very small vendor, I don't know of any intelligent analyst group or people that have existed in open source a long period of time. If you're going into production, you want a safety net behind you. You want some sort of a support model, whether that's a consulting group that supports open source, the commercial vendor itself. That's one of the primary things you want to look at. And you want to make sure that the viability of that vendor is strong. They're not just somebody that's come on the scene recently. They have a good, strong track record of being able to support companies like yours.
You use the word defunct, the project they were using completely defunct. And that is the beauty of open source, that depending on what license was used, if the company who is the original creator of the project, and we have seen forks happen all the time with open source, that project will survive even if it changed the ownership, and if the project happened to be part of any neutral foundation, then there are more chances of it still, because you're not going to rely on a project or software product that may not even exist 2 or 3 years from now. So when you bet on open source, you also ensure that kind of sustainability of the project. So it will not happen that in some cases, even you may develop enough expertise to take kind of ownership or maintenance of that project. So that gives you much more say in the sustainability of the project. Now, one thing more which is important with open source, I actually run a show with Dirk Honda from VMware, which is all about open source. So one thing is that when companies use open source, it's very easy to use open source, but it's a little bit difficult to understand how open source actually works. There are a lot of legal ramifications. You have to also understand, you might mix a lot of code which may not be allowed by the license. You may be mixing GPL version 3, 8 GPL, you may be using it doesn't. So you should have a very concrete strategy towards open source. I mean, if you're small, that's fine. What if you grow? What if you become a target for acquisition? Suddenly you run into all those trouble. So using code is easy, but can you also talk about the role of things like either open source program office or having a very concrete open source strategy as part of your product roadmap also?
Yeah. So again, other people may have different opinions, but at least from my background in open source, the vast majority of the time, and this is going to sound a little crass to say it this way, but this is the way it comes across. A lot of people get into open source because they want something for nothing. And that's not, while cost control and everything else is one aspect of using open source, it's certainly not something you want to just utilize blindly and say, okay, because this thing is free, I'm now going to implement it throughout my company. Because as you said, there's a lot of ramifications down the road in terms of, okay, if I begin to mix some of this code in with ours, what does that really mean? What are my responsibilities from a legal standpoint in terms of contributing back and everything else? So you want to definitely look at the various licenses that are utilized, and I've been in all of them, basically, GPL or Apache or whatever else. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but you need to be able to look at that type of thing. And then Again, what I have seen, even large companies, and I'm talking some of the internet giants, the mistakes that they made is they believe they can go it alone. They believe they can hire a staff that's going to be able to be dedicated to that open source project. They are going to contribute the code that they're going to need, perhaps that the community or the vendor won't come up with. And I have seen it just fall over almost every single time, at least in the open source projects that I have been involved with. And so I think that there's got to be a recognition of the fact that indeed you're going to have staff that will have expertise in the product itself, but you should never think that I'm going to be able to stand and do this on my own, because staff comes and goes, your expertise is going to leave, and if your whole staff walks out, like that happened to that electronics retailer I was talking about, you could be in for a very big world of hurt. So bottom line is you need to approach the acquisition of open source software much like you would the acquisition of proprietary software, but just with the recognition that it comes with the things that we've already talked about, the licensing and the responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera.
One more thing is, since you're talking about that company and open source or any software, proprietary is a bit different. Open source becomes more or less a supply chain, because you're not talking about just one project. That project may rely on 20 different libraries. It may rely on 30 different other projects. So you're looking at the whole supply chain. Even if you look, let's say you pull a container, it has all the open source. You do not know what is in that container. So knowing what is going in the product or the service you're baking in, that is also important. You should have visibility. You should have some transparency, because there will be a lot of, one library will be connecting to other library and there will be a framework. So you should have that visibility into the code that you're consuming. So you should have a very good understanding of open source. So you should have dedicated teams who understand how it works.
And the quality control problems that can come from that chain that you're talking about. Because with the proprietary software, there's an expectation of performance testing and everything else that goes in. And sometimes you might be in for a rude awakening when you're using open source projects, especially multiples of them that have differing degrees of that type of thing.
Right, because you may be using a very popular project with everybody using, but then you're using one more library which only 5 people are using, and tomorrow that library's maintainer just goes away. Or we have seen, SSL and all those things, SSH happened where there was only one maintainer of that project, and Linux Foundation went there to support that. So yeah, you are absolutely right about just because you're using open source doesn't mean you don't do any homework. You should do as much homework about open source as you would do with any proprietary, any other technology out there. Now, one more thing is that as you as a company increase your dependency on open source, you will at some point evolve from being a consumer to a user and then even contributor. And open source communities are, when it comes to, they do focus a lot on code quality. So how should companies look? Because sometimes it can be intimidating also to participate in some of the discussions. So how should they kind of prepare themselves to become active contributors, good citizens of open source as well?
Yeah, so it almost always starts off with the QA function that we're talking about here. So they will begin to download new releases of the various project and begin to test that, and then become a submitter of issues and bugs and track that through whatever mechanisms the open source project or the vendor that's leading the project has for that type of thing. That's the most common. That, again, in the 3 to 4 open source projects I've been involved in, that's what the vast majority of people do. Being able to actually contribute features, that's a horse of a different color. And there's this illusion out there, again, I can speak only from the projects that I have been involved in, but there's an illusion out there that there is this endless supply of benevolent developers who are just waiting and eager to constantly work on an open source project and contribute back to it. That's oftentimes not the case. As an example, at MySQL, I was there for 5 years, and the number of contributions we actually got from a code standpoint, I could count on one hand in those 5 years. So now it's a little different in some of the others. I went on to a Postgres project and had a little bit more. But what you find is that the vast majority of contributors are people who have real skin in the game. They are companies that have made this large commitment to open source. You've mentioned a few of them. They will have staff that's devoted to doing this type of non-recurrent engineering work that oftentimes a vendor might do, they will do and contribute back to the project because they need it for their own purposes. Or you will have consulting groups that specialize in this open source project, and to maintain street credibility, they will contribute back to the open source to ensure that we're a big contributor of that. That, at least in my experience, has been the lion's share of who contributes back to an actual project from a contribution software standpoint.
Right. No, yeah, there are, because at times it does become how much stake you have in that project. So you, even if you are maintaining a community project, there are a lot of vendor neutral open source projects, but you want a stake because you have an ecosystem around there which you will leverage. You will not leverage the project directly. So yes, you're right. A lot of companies, they do put in a lot of efforts, even if there is a big booming ecosystem. Now, I want to come back to Netdata, and before we wrap this up, how important is open source for you folks?
Yeah, the executive leadership here at Netdata has made the commitment. For those that don't know, Netdata, we are an infrastructure monitoring company. And so we have software that assists in IT stack monitoring and things like that. And the executive leadership here has made the commitment that all monitoring functionality provided by Netdata will be free. And that can be either in the option of having open source or proprietary software, as in our cloud product, that's still free. And so, for example, here we have an agent that people are able to install on their Linux machines and be able to very quickly get up and running in terms of monitoring whatever IT stack. It auto-discovers everything that's installed on your IT stack, and you can get up and going. And all of that is GPL. All of that is open source. People can do with it as they choose. We have plenty of open source forums where people bat these ideas around. We're one of the most popular sets of software on GitHub, where people interact with us and give us suggestions and things like that. So open source is critical to Netdata because I guess it embodies the spirit behind the company, that we very much want to make IT infrastructure monitoring available for everyone. And that means whether you know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing, you have a big checkbook, you have no checkbook at all, we're able to actually support you in that regard.
Robin, thank you so much for this discussion. We don't talk about this topic often, but I think this is very important topic. As much as we all use open source, we do have to keep reminding about these things, that just because you are a user of open source doesn't mean that you should not care about these things. You gave some very good tips that you should look at the sustainability of the project. There should be a vendor, there should be a community, and then when you are using project internally, you should have a strategy so that you do know what is going in your supply chain. So thanks for this great discussion, and I would love to have you again on the show. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.